Welcome, Duke alumni and friends, to this session of the Duke Alumni Forever Learning Institute. I'm Jamal Michelle, Assistant Director of Communications at the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute, and I am thrilled to have you joining us today for our session on environmental humanities, culture, climate, and community. This is the third session in our Why the Humanities Matter, the Sense of Social series. And for those not familiar, at Duke, the FHI serves as a hub for the humanities, interdisciplinary collaboration, and today's discussion examines how the humanities shape our understanding of climate change and ecological futures. We'll also have time for Q&A at the end, so please feel free to drop any and all of your questions in the chat as you think of them. You'll also be asked to complete a brief survey at the end of the session. We'd appreciate any and all of your responses. Today, I'm here to moderate the program, and I'm privileged to be joined by Saskia Corns, Assistant Professor of the Practice at the FHI, Gustavo Furtado, Associate Professor of Romance Studies at the Trinity College of Arts and Sciences, and Jarvis McInnis, Associate Professor of English at Duke University. Saskia brings together teaching, regenerative agriculture, and humanities scholarship to rethink our relationship to food and to the land and people who grow it. Since 2009, she's worked in and around the campus farm movement to build climate resilience and cultivate durable imaginaries in people and places. Trained as a Renaissance literature scholar and shaped by years of hands-on farming, her work bridges environmental thought, agriculture, and public humanities. Gustavo's research and teaching focuses on media, space, and territory, with particular interest in Latin American literature and cinema, documentary film, and indigenous film and video. He's the author of documentary filmmaking in contemporary Brazil and is currently working on a new project examining media, territory, and the senses in the Amazon. Jarvis is an interdisciplinary scholar of African American and African diaspora literature and culture. His work focuses on the global South, Black geographies and ecologies, sound studies, visual culture, and the archive. His latest book, Afterlives of the Plantation, Plotting Agrarian Futures in the Global Black South, explores an alternative genealogy of Black modernity by centering Tuskegee as a key site of transnational Black intellectual and cultural exchange. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I'd like to briefly turn the floor over to you, Saskia, to talk a little bit about the work that you do in the humanities. Oh, it looks like we've got some technical difficulties with Saskia. Gustavo, we'll turn it over to you until Saskia is ready, and then we'll get her back in here.
Sounds good. Do you want to ask me a question or should I go with
Oh, you could just let us know your relationship and your work in the
yeah,
humanities, and then we'll get
sure.
into some of the good questions.
Sure. So at Duke, I work with a lot of film studies, literary studies, cultural studies. One of my areas of interest is the Amazon, which is partly why I am here in this group today. Should I say a little more about that right now, Jamal?
Oh, yeah, please let me know whatever
Uh,
projects you're working on as well.
so I'll talk a little bit about how I approach the Amazon and questions of cinema and media, both in my teaching and my research. And the Amazon has been a place that has attracted tremendous attention since the 1540s when the first travelers from Europe traveled through the extension of the river has been narrated by travelers throughout the centuries and also been an attraction for filmmakers, photographers, painters, illustrators, all the way to the present. It has also been a place largely misunderstood and visualized in some very disturbing ways. To give you one illustration that I think brings the question of the visual to the forefront, it has often been seen as a chaotic jungle, as a place where culture goes to die. It's a place where people disappear and get eaten alive, or something of the sort. But more recent archaeology, botany, anthropology has revealed that much of the forest is anthropogenic, that it has been actually selected over centuries and millennia to sustain large populations of people. So what looks to outsiders as a chaotic jungle may in fact be an orchard or the ruins of an orchard. But we can't see it that way. We're not able to see it that way. So my work tends to approach the Amazon as a problem for seeing, as a problem of how can we visualize this place and understand it differently. And I approach it by engaging with indigenous film, the work of photographers and artists that are revealing very different aspects of the Amazon, such as the Amazon as an Afro-descendant place, or the Amazon as a shamanic sort of territory, and things of the sort. With indigenous groups in particular, even what we consider visible and invisible can be very different. So, like, there are problems that emerge about not just how do we see this forest? Is it a jungle? Is it an orchard? But also what is considered visible and real in this particular space. Fortunately, the output of interesting literary, but also visual, photographic, artistic work in the past 30 years or so has been tremendous. So the Amazon Lab dealt with that through a series of seminars, study groups. We focused on maps and counter mapping. We focused on image memory and museums, always staging cross-disciplinary, multicultural, multilinguistic conversations that are also crucial to my work as a scholar.
Thank you for that, Gustavo. And I'm sure we're going to get more into the Amazon Lab work too with the questions later on. Saskia, we're glad to have you back. Sorry we lost you, but we're just quickly going around and talking a little bit about our relationship to the humanities, some of our work, some of what we've done at Duke and beyond. So if you want to just take the next couple of minutes to tell us about you and your work and where you're at right now in environmental humanities.
Absolutely. Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Saskia Corns, and I am an assistant professor of the practice at the Franklin Humanities Institute. And it's also my great joy to be the director of the Duke Campus Farm Program, which is a 1-acre working farm that's powered primarily by students. As Jamal mentioned, I'm a Renaissance literary scholar by training. Um, I study the transition from land as a gift to land as a commodity in 17th century England, most commonly known as enclosure. So I looked at the actual historical process of enclosure, as well as authors that we now understand as canonical, people like Shakespeare and Milton, but also people that are now primarily read only in academic circles, but were very popular at the time, responded to this world historical shift and tried to make sense of it through plays, through poetry, through different kinds of cultural production. And a really important archive for me also in that study was looking at husbandry manuals. So looking at how-to manuals for farmers of that period and how farmers actually understood the commodification of land that was happening all around them and how it affected their practices. One of the reasons I was so interested in manuals specifically as an archive is because by vocation, I'm a farmer. I love to grow food and steward land, and was very interested in how people who actually worked the land were understanding this transition. Another reason I really focused on this period is because for me, it's one version of an origin story for climate change. So I was very interested in the question of how we came to have this specific orientation to the more than human world as a commodity and how we might start to reverse those trends. And that led me in more or less direct ways to the work that I do now, both as a scholar and as director of the Duke Campus Farm. So this is a place where we are really working to build a different kind of intimacy between students and the more than human world, between students and plants, between students and soils, and between students and a broader kind of ecology that they can really see themselves embedded within. So the work of the farm for me is really part and parcel and kind of a natural extension of my classroom teaching and my research. And it's a wonderful to me to be able to use my whole self in that work and to bring students into it.
Thank you so much for that, Saskia. I think it's also important to recognize an area that might be, seemingly disparate or separated from the humanities, but actually is quite integral to the conversations we're having about the environment. And that brings us to Jarvis. Tell us a little bit about your relationship to the humanities.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jamal. So my name is Jarvis McInnis. I'm an associate professor of English here at Duke, where I teach African American and African diaspora literature and culture. And so I'll share here. I have a a slide presentation here briefly to share a little bit about my most recent book, which is entitled Afterlives of the Plantation: Plotting Agrarian Futures in the Global Black South. And this book takes up Tuskegee Institute, which is the school that was founded by Booker T. Washington in 1881, and thinks about the challenges the way that Tuskegee is taken up in African American studies. Typically, it's regarded as a backward and sort of parochial and provincial institution because it was largely an industrial and agricultural school. But I realized that in the late 19th to early 20th century, Tuskegee was actually quite significant to Black people in other parts of the hemisphere where slavery had also existed, places like Cuba and Haiti and Puerto Rico. And students were being sent there. Political leaders were going to Tuskegee to learn about the agricultural methods that Booker T. Washington and someone like George Washington Carver were cultivating there. And so I think about Tuskegee as a nodal point, as a kind of diasporic hub, as this international hub in the middle of the rural Jim Crow South. And so here we have Booker T. Washington and his wife, his third wife, Margaret Murray Washington, just in case you don't have their image at the forefront of your mind in the way that I do. And so I'm interested in the book in the way that Tuskegee is represents the what I call the repurposed plantation. It's founded on the grounds of a former cotton plantation and was transformed into an international and sort of world-renowned institution. And I was really fascinated by what it meant that Booker T. Washington thought, as you can see in this quote, that it was appropriate to transform an abandoned, degraded plantation that had been degraded by cotton cultivation into a future-oriented educational institution for Black people. And so, after the first 25 years of Tuskegee, the campus it was transformed into something that looks like this. Now, this is a speculative view of the institution, but still, it gives you a sense of the way that they transformed the landscape into something that that actually counteracted the original violence of the plantation as a system. And so in my work, I sit with and think critically about the work of someone like George Washington Carver, who had a really important ecological vision, wherein he believed in that regenerating the earth was part and parcel of regenerating people. And so he's interested in the rebuilding, the building up the soils of the South, and then disseminating that knowledge to poor Black people in the countryside through Tuskegee's agricultural extension programs, such as the Jessup Agricultural Wagon, through farmers' conferences, wherein they brought Black farmers to campus as early as 1892 to teach them up-to-date agricultural methods. And so what I'll say too, they also incorporated diagrams such as the one you see here, wherein they disseminated these visions for how to lay out a 40-acre farm and to take care of the land in doing so. And so my work is really interested in the way that Tuskegee is trying to reclaim and rebrand agriculture in the aftermath of slavery as something that is not uh, as something that is not degrading, but something that is actually proprietorial for Black people. And so we see these images of students working in an agricultural laboratory doing soil analysis, and they circulated these images throughout their print cultural publications. So I'll talk a bit more about this, about these images, about the importance of the visual as we move forward. But I just wanted you to see it at the outset of the presentation to get it into your mind. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Jarvis. And I think it's an important reminder of what this panel represents, which is that intersection of ecology, agriculture, and history. And I think those areas often get overlooked when you think about them in relation to the humanities. And so, Saskia, I actually wanted to start with you because your work brings together regenerative agriculture, environmental humanities, hands-on teaching. And I'd love to really start with how you think the humanities help us understand food and farming, not as just systems of production, but as relationships to land, labor, memory, and even community.
Thanks for that question. Yeah, I think I just wrapped up a wonderful course, teaching a wonderful course called Food Farming and Feminism. So I'm going to use that as a as a kind of a jumping off point. I also apologize. I live in a rural area, and so my internet can be a little bit unstable, but I'm here with you, and yeah, soldiering on. So in that class, we looked at this kind of growing contradiction between how we farm in the United States and how we imagine farmers. So when we think of the dominant methods of farming in the United States, these are clearly industrialized, right? And I don't just mean the intensification of production in our agricultural systems or the automation of agricultural work, but really a change in mindset that views the ways we produce food as really a series of landscapes, ecologies, communities that are interchangeable parts within a broader global system. But at the same time, most of us still tend to imagine farming in more of a pastoral mode. So we might imagine people who farm as being parts of a landowning nuclear family who are directly engaged in agricultural labor. We imagine them for the most part as having a harmonious relationship with nature. We tend to think of farming as a vocation, right? One associated with independence, with hard work, with a certain kind of moral fortitude. And we see this image in everything, right? From Super Bowl commercials to Instagram influencers. It's a very sticky cultural trope. So, one thing that humanities can do, or one thing that we tackled in the class, is really to help us use the humanistic inquiry to help us contextualize these elements of our shared cultural imagination and to see and unpack this tension between our current how what is happening in our current food system and what we imagine to be happening, the ways that we imagine and in many ways idealize farmers. And I see this as a critical first step in moving towards ways of growing food that are more sustaining for the planet and for the people who are actually doing that work. Also use humanistic inquiry in really in the ways that I approach farming. So thinking about farming is one of the oldest relationships that we have with the more than human world. It's really a process that's rich with possibilities for reciprocity and also for all of the messiness, right? That a true intimacy, a true kind of relationship entails. And maybe in conversation with Jarvis's work, like if you're farming in the South, it's very likely that you're farming on post-plantation soils. So you're in close contact with, close relationship with these landscapes that have seen tremendous harm. So at the Duke Campus Farm, one of the questions that we're asking is, what does it mean to farm regeneratively in this context? Who or what are we regenerating? And the humanities can help us to think historically, to think ethically, to think contextually, and to orient towards these practices of regeneration in a different way, in a way that can really appreciate the specificities of each landscape and its communities.
Thank you for that, Saskia. I think it also speaks to this sort of undoing of imaginaries, like reclaiming or even deconstructing them, and how we view things like farming, how we view the ground, who tills it, um, where that ground came from, and who or what made use of that ground and to what ends. And it makes me think about how that's represented even in like film and media. So that actually brings me to you, Gustavo, um, and your work on media and territory and the Amazon. And I think that it asks us to think about climate and environment through questions of space, representation, and power. And so I wanted to ask you, how do film and visual media shape the way that people imagine environmental crises, especially as it pertains to the Amazon? And what can the humanities help us see that other dominant areas might frequently overlook?
I mean, it's sort of a broader question here that environmental crisis is a very difficult thing to visualize for starts, right? It's a thing that occurs at a scale and a time that are not ordinary. You know, you can say that a hurricane might have environmental causes or like climate change causes, but it's very hard to actually see that, right? The things that we're talking about are difficult to see. So in a broader sense, it is a problem for the visual climate change. And is stimulating a lot of reflection and forms of representation to try to address it, because it's also a challenge for us to relate to it in some fundamental way. But I'll focus more on the Amazon to just narrow it down a little bit. One thing that's really interesting about a place like the Amazon is that it's crucial for the climate. It's huge in our imaginations, globally speaking. I think there are few people on the planet that don't have some associated image with the Amazon, but it's not visited by a lot of people, right? It exists at the level of images. It circulates as an image primarily. And I think that because the Amazon also represents a place that I think it's difficult in the US to realize that it's sort of like a place that has not been integrated into global capitalism as effectively as, say, the American West was 150 years ago, right? It's a place that somehow has remained a problem for the approach of nation states and of capital throughout the centuries. Because it's difficult, like it poses a challenge for how we think about land development. Like, for instance, Saskia's farming doesn't work. That model of farming doesn't work in the Amazon very well, right? So when travelers go to the Amazon and try to do that kind of farming, they usually fail, right? Because it actually poses a challenge for how we understand our relationship with the land, with plants, right? So it's this place that has kind of poses a particularly great challenge for how we visualize and see things, but it's also over-imaged. It's also particularly spectacular for the visual. So what I think we need to do as people who are not in the Amazon, I mean, I go to the Amazon often, who are not there, is we have to take this opportunity to transform the ways we see and think about the world through the complexities that the Amazon and the people who are there provide, right? And it's sort of like it challenges how we understand of the human nature divide. It challenges how we see natural versus cultivated, right? It basically presents a paradigm challenge for us in general. And what I tend to do in my work and in my teaching is to try to accentuate and bring that to the fore. Uh, um, the kinds of materials that I find most interesting for doing that and that are at the center of my research are films that deviate from standard forms of narrative, that in some form become contaminated as narrative films by ways of understanding time or story from the Amazon, films that push the boundaries of documentary representation, that somehow they're not satisfied with just looking at a place. They're troubled by the fact that seeing something with a camera is not can be very misleading. And films made by people who are often visualized and described, but have not themselves been producing audiovisual work for a long time. So, like indigenous populations are particularly important in that respect. You know, since the 1980s, there's been an explosion of indigenous filmmaking in the Amazon that is very eclectic as a body of work. Often very difficult for scholars and students to engage with on a first level because they're growing out from 200 different indigenous languages and communities that draw from distinct cosmologies, histories, traditions, right? So I think that there's like, in a sense, the biodiversity of the Amazon has a cultural diversity side to it and has a visual diversity that's been lacking. And I think it's one of our tasks as scholars and as people to engage with it in a more profound and troubling way.
Thank you for that, Gustavo. And it adds another layer to that intersection where it's actually not only the ecology, but also geography. I feel like in recent years, I'm seeing more and more people contend with and reckon with this term, the global South, right? And the adversarial positioning that the imperial world has in relation to the global South. And I think more and more people are talking about that, and it reminds me of your latest book, Jarvis, and the work that you're doing, which traces the connections between Black life, land, ecology, and the archive in the global South. And I was curious how a humanities approach helps us understand climate and environmental questions as inseparable and almost irrevocably bound to history, race, and struggles over belonging and survival.
Yeah, thank you, Jamal. It's a really great question. I think the way that I'll take it up, I'll enter it is through the plantation itself. And so in my work, I take up the plantation as a genocidal and an ecocidal technology, right? That's played a crucial role in ushering in the modern world order. And so instead of the Anthropocene, right, as a concept that attempts to sort of name humans' deleterious impact on the environment. Some scholars opt for the plantational scene, right, as a term that more accurately captures the exploitative practices associated with the plantation, right? So settler colonialism, slavery, monocrop agriculture, right, and other modes of resource extraction, and how those have contributed to climate change. And I would say that that's where my work sits, and in terms of wrestling with the history of race, and it's important to note that even within this notion of the plantational scene, right, not all humans are equally responsible, right, for the plantation social and environmental degradation, right? Enslaved and colonized peoples in particular, right, were not the perpetrators, right? They were forced to do the labor, right, that exploited the earth, but they were in conditions of subjection, right? And so, thinking with and through the plantation as a modern technology, and what I mean by modern meaning, like it helped to usher in again the modern world, the discovery of the Americas, or discovery, right, and colonization of the Americas. By thinking with and through it, it allows us to get to the particularities of the way that different groups of people, sit differently within this modern world, and are differently responsible, I suppose, right, for what has happened, for the effects of climate change. And I suppose lastly, what I would share is that, by thinking through the plantation in this way, right, as a technology that helped to usher in the modern world order, it's important to understand that it's not only an economic system, or it's not only a system of labor organization, right, that produce crops for the global market, for instance, right, but it's a deeply cultural institution as well, and that has shaped literature, right, that's shaped film. Think Gone with the Wind, right? Think music, think, Negro spirituals and the blues, right? Architecture and landscape design, think plantation mansions and plantation tours, right? And the list really goes on and on. And so, sort of taking a multimedia approach to the plantation, and to Tuskegee in particular, for my work was so crucial, because I realized that I needed to think at the intersection of both agriculture and aesthetics, right? To understand Black rural life and culture as modern and sophisticated. And actually, if we break down the word agriculture, right, there's culture, right, embedded in the term itself, right? So it's not only about the environmental, aspect, or the farming aspect, but that farming, those farmers are people who listen to music, who write poetry, who are reading newspapers and magazines, and so forth and so on. And so I draw on this vast literature that Tuskegee produced, right, agricultural bulletins and newspapers. But I also think about the way that the students and the faculty built the buildings, right, that they redesigned the landscape, that they built the buildings so that they fell in line with the land, so that they didn't have to transform it in the way that the plantation would remake the landscape, that they regenerated the soil, and they use photographs also as a way to project an image of themselves to the world as fundamentally modern, as new Negroes, we might say. And so I think, thinking again at the intersection of the environmental and the aesthetic, recognizing that they are part and parcel of the same project through the plantation, has been my way of getting at the environmental, or my approach to the environmental humanities.
Thank you for that, Jarvis. And a striking feature that seems to come out of everyone's work is the prevalence of the culture, of the story. And so this question now I pose to all of you, and anyone feel free to jump right in. Because I think about the humanities, I think about the work that scholars like yourselves do in unearthing stories, and I wonder, what role do those stories, whether literary, visual, archival, what do they play in
Mm,
shaping how communities understand environmental loss, how
mm.
they understand resilience, and even how they understand possibility?
I would say that the plantation obfuscates, actually, that it actually renders the harm invisible. And that's what it's supposed to do. I mean, plantations, if you've ever been to one, they're, especially the ones that were established in the 19th century, U.S. South by very wealthy planters were very beautiful spaces with large, with these grand homes. Again, think Gone with the Wind. And so the emphasis, if we think about contemporary plantation tourism, unless it's a place like Stagville or unless that really takes seriously the lives of the of the people who were enslaved there, and also the people who were the indigenous peoples who were dispossessed of their lands, unless it's that approach to the plantation. Many of them actually play up and sort of celebrate, right, the beauty of the homes or the beauty of the botanical gardens that existed outside of them. And there are some instances wherein they refer to enslaved people as workers, right? Completely erasing the fact that they were coerced, right? And that they were not there of their own volition, that they were property, that they did not belong to themselves. And so I think that if we're thinking with and through the plantation, in particular, I think that it seeks to obfuscate, right? I think that it seeks to erase the history of violence that it actually ushered in, and that we still live with to this very day.
If I may jump in, yeah, I think thinking about the question of the indigenous, which really interests me a lot, preoccupies me a lot. Indigenous people have been historically the objects of foreign discourses, right? They've played minor roles in the history of the West and the history of nations in the Americas. And has been an amazing phenomenon in the past 40 years or so, right? The sort of emergence of major indigenous artists, intellectuals, writers, filmmakers, who are, in a sense, like not just speaking back and correctively, but also like speaking amongst themselves and speaking to different communities of people, and who create very different versions of history, both past and future, right? It's sort of, to give one example that was very central for the Amazon Lab, we spent a year kind of obsessed with a book called The Falling Sky by Davi Kopenawa and Bruce Albert. Is a massive volume in which Davi Kopenawa is a indigenous leader, but also a shaman, Yanomami shaman. The Yanomamis are in the northern part of Brazil, southern Venezuela. And it's a book built from 15 years of him reminiscing about his life and speaking back to various issues that preoccupy him. But it casts a very different history of the world. Sort of he's fully aware of Christianity, of science, of the West, of capitalism. But he speaks of history from a perspective that has different sorts of origins and different kinds of destinies, right? For instance, right, in the cosmology that Kopenhawa articulates, um, uh, humans are not a special kind of animal, uh, because other animals were at some point human too, or will become human at some point. There's a shared humanity among beings, not universally shared, but it's like basically like instead of animality being a common concept and humanity being a sort of variation, humanity is a basic shared quality, and types of animals emerge out of that humanity. The result of that logic is that living in a forest is having a very complex diplomatic relationship among different kinds of human beings, right? Who have a very different idea of origin, as well as a future. The falling sky is sort of a prophecy of the end of the world. The premise is that Yanomami shamans, their work is largely consisted of keeping the sky from falling upon our heads, which has happened in a previous cataclysm. Should all the shamans be eliminated, the forest will be very sick and the sky will fall again. It's sort of an apocalyptic prophecy, but it's not inevitable. It's one that is perfectly avoidable, right? It includes preserving particular kinds of knowledge and particular kinds of cultural practices and particular kinds of cosmologies that are as endangered as certain species are, that are as threatened by outside forces as the forest itself is. So it's sort of, sort of like invites us to question origins and destinies and who are the protagonists of stories. It's a very interesting topic to compare with what Amitav Ghosh calls the Great Derangement, and it's a book that probably people in this room have read, right? The Great Derangement argues that it's a wonderful book that argues that one of the problems of climate change is that our prevailing storytelling form, the realist novel, is profoundly inadequate to speak about the kinds of agencies and events that we are being brought to face, right? So it's a particularly important time to like imagine how to tell stories of places and people that have different genre boundaries, different kinds of actors, different kinds of agencies at work. And so I think our engagement as scholars, as humans, as teachers, as students should be to try to be confronted and engage with those sorts of ideas seriously. And it's what has been happening in a sense, right? It's like this is happening now. There's like major intellectuals speaking from different places in a way that's never happened before. And it should affect how we talk about the things that we have always talked about in different ways.
I just put The Falling Sky on my summer reading list. Thank you for that, Gustavo. Yeah, I think a lot about our students. I think about the students at Power Our Farm. I think about the students in my classroom, and I really see and sense their absolutely understandable fears and anxieties about the future, the ways that potentially forces them into certain definitions of a good life. And I think a big part of my work is offering them the opportunity or even a felt sense of a different storyline, right? A felt sense, a different story about a positive relationship with the more than human world that's not worshipful or idealizing, but actually very everyday. And understanding that a long-term positive impact when again is visible in how we've seen our post-plantation soils change over the last 15 years. And to not just explain that to students or have them read about it, but have them really see it and understand it and work with that in a really intimate way with their bodies, right? With all of their senses, to have an intellectual understanding of what's happening, but also to learn to attune and respect to and understand different ways of knowing that are happening from the neck down, information that they're actually getting from plants, from soil, being able to attune to that information, to take that in and respond. And I think altogether, this experience creates a new storyline for them, right? What it means to be a young person right now in the context of climate change. Some people say capitalism, the Plantationocene, all of these massive, massive systems that are telling a particular story that's leading towards collapse. What is an alternative narrative that they can actually participate in a very everyday way? And how might that change how they orient towards their lives after Duke?
Thank you for that. I think, in thinking about futurity and the next generation of scholars and students and people who will be taking up the work that we do and don't do, one of the last questions I wanted to pose to the group before we transition to audience questions is when we talk about something like, sustainability, we often default to a kind of technical language. And I wanted to know, how can the humanities help us think more deeply about the historical and imaginative dimensions, but also the ethical dimensions of building a sustainable future? Because your work often is that of an excavator. You're going through stories and histories. And I wonder how the humanities now plays in looking at a sustainable future.
I mean, I think that one of the many parts of that is that we have a very problematic relationship with what we call nature. And it's very profound. It sort of underwrites even the university has, right, has like the sciences and the humanities, right? It sort of underwrites how we operate intellectually, physically, spiritually in the world. And it's a problem that's been noted by many people and has been, and it's an interesting problem in the history of Western culture. So it's not like it's a homogeneous fact, right? But we are dealing with a particularly powerful moment in which that issue is at stake of how we understand this thing that we have called nature, and very problematically put, as Saskia said, somewhere out there instead of being like something we're touching, right? It's like nature is like there's culture and there's nature. So I think that the humanities play a crucial role in intervening in how we understand the relation between culture and nature, how we think of nature, what is nature, historicizing it, putting it in a sort of multicultural, like much more complex context, right? And then the other thing is that we have understood, you mentioned about futurity, right? We have also very troubling ideas about past and future. I was just having my last class with my film studies class recently, and we're seeing some apocalyptic movies. And it's we are, a lot of us living today, the students are oppressed by a sense of an imminent end of time. There's a sense of closure, right? It's not universally shared, but many of us feel the sense of like, wow, time is running out, right? And that plays very well with an idea of time that has a beginning, that is a creation or an origin, and has an end, right? But many people in this planet have been living past ends of worlds. Many people have, in my particular class, we're looking at Afrofuturism. So it's like many people have understood the experience of Afro-descendant people as a post-end of the world experience, that life doesn't end. The world continues, right? Or indigenous people have seen their world be destroyed, and they haven't disappeared. They continue to exist as indigenous people, finding meaning, building new worlds out of the fragments of worlds that have passed. So I think we have to culturally change the way we think about time as something that ends sometime ahead of us, and understand it instead as like a perennial challenge of living, surviving, thriving in changing conditions. Right. So I feel like nature culture and an idea of futurity that allows for a less like beginning end idea of time are two areas that are particularly important for humanistic inquiry and teaching.
Thank you all so much for that. Really appreciated your responses, but also what you start to get at when we think of the relationship of the humanities with the environment. And so what I'd like to do now is transition over to some audience questions. If you've got anything to ask, please drop it in the chat. We'll try and get through some of those. So I'll just take a couple of moments to wait for that. And as we wait for audience questions to trickle in, I did have, I guess, there's a follow-up question for the group. And it's less so about your work and maybe work that you're seeing elsewhere. Where do you see the strongest connection between culture and climate right now? Maybe other researchers or scholars or other projects that you've encountered even outside of the humanities.
I'm leaving my colleagues to answer because I just spoke a lot and I don't want to speak too much.
Please, you're all good.
Okay, as a humanist, I've been particularly impressed by the work of scientists in the Amazon who are changing the way we understand that place's history. And I mentioned in the beginning, like this idea that like this jungle is an orchard, right? But it's not legible to my eye, really blows my mind, right? So in the past decades, what used to be thought of as an environment hostile to culture and uninhabited by small groups of people has been substantively altered to be a previously semi-urban space where people managed land in a very different way, right? This is the work of scientists, mainly archaeologists, but also like ethnobotanists and botanists, right? And it's like that, it's fascinating. It's like this is the stuff that humanists think about, right? Like thinking about different ways of seeing the present, the past, the future, but it's happening in the sciences. And obviously for how we think of the future, to think of like entirely distinct ways of occupying space and drawing livelihood from it and thriving in it. Things that like it was impossible for a city to be in this place. Now we know that there were like large settlements in the Amazon. So that's been one of the most interesting outside my field areas of inquiry that I have found.
I'll just say, perhaps I'll speak to a continuation, right, of something that began in the 1890s, the Tuskegee Farmers Conference. It actually continues to this day. So it's about 130 something years old now. And so I'm just fascinated to see, I've been fascinated by the ways that that project, that vision that, Booker T. Washington and his faculty established as early as 1892, I believe, was the first one, wherein they invited Black farmers to campus to teach them up-to-date agricultural methods rooted in caring for the earth and rooted in teaching them to, grow nourishing foods for their bodies so that they did not purchase food from the local commissary and remain insistent in cycles of perpetual debt. The way that those ideas or that sort of investment in sort of gathering collectivity and the democratization and dissemination of knowledge, right? Agricultural knowledge remains pertinent, right? And has persisted to 2026, right? So every February, I believe. I don't believe it's called the Tuskegee Farmers Conference, but it is I believe it goes by a different name. But the fact that it persists to this day tells us that there's a lot for us to learn from past agricultural visions or past environmental visions that we can bring forward. So much of what George Washington Carver, for instance, taught about composting and about sustainable agricultural methods remains pertinent to this very day. And so I have been really struck by just how prescient, I suppose, those projects were, and how important they continue to be.
Thank you both for that. I have, oh, Saskia, please, I saw you unmute.
I'll just add quickly that I think I've been drawing a lot of inspiration lately by young farmers in the South who are really reviving people's relationship with plants by a lot of seed cultivation and seed rematriation. So there are a lot of new and exciting small scale seed producers, people like Ujamaa, the Heirloom Collards Project, the Utopian Seed Project, Grand Prismatic. So these are really kind of bringing plants of cultural significance back into circulation and really using these plants to both tell stories of communities and their cultures and foodways, but also kind of reignite new stories as these seeds circulate and are enjoyed by people across the country. And that's been really, it's been fun to grow those seeds, but also to just see this community and these relationships grow.
That's a good transition, Saskia, because one of the audience questions I was going to bring up asks, Dr. Corns mentioned this, that she supports students' ability to cultivate person-environment relationships that are neither unrealistically romantic nor totally fatalistic. What's one thing you do to cultivate this relationship? At least for your students on the farm, Saskia.
Sorry, Jamal, I lost you for 1 second. Could you,
Yeah, you're
I can
totally
see the
fine.
question in the chat. Was there follow-up from that?
No, no, no. This is that one.
Okay, wait, let me find it again.
Yeah, you're totally fine. Please.
It was something about what's one more thing you do to cultivate this relationship between people and the environment. Um, I spend a lot of time building what a soil humanities scholar named Anna Kashivashinska, excuse me, calls building soil publics, right? So really
Mhm.
encouraging my students and others to have to really see soils as the mind-bending expansive ecology that they are, right? The Earth is a living entity that's more complex really than anything we can possibly imagine. And what would it be to be in relationship with this whole world, right? This sort of cosmos that's beneath our feet. So we do that by teaching cultivation practices, but also just encouraging people to be in closer contact with soil, right? To lie on it, to walk on it, to dance on it, to touch it, to feel it, to taste it. Um, and that's also something I think about in the land that I steward where I live. So I feel lucky that I get to do that on the daily.
And I think you do the heavy lift of what folks might think is overextending yourself to try and like you're reaching to try and establish a relationship between the earth and the humanities or the earth and the academic space when in fact they're again like irrevocably bound in all these ways that we don't really talk about through stories and history and the environment. But I think I can get one more audience question in. This comes from Robert, and please, anyone, feel free to jump in. And this is often a question we get in the other panels that we've had. But how do you think the humanities can have a more powerful voice or make a stronger position in the discussion of climate change, where STEM voices are louder and humanities departments are being cut? We could have a separate panel on this, but I think that's really top of mind for a lot of people. How do we make humanities' voices stronger, more powerful as it pertains to climate change?
I mean, that's the question, right? Sort of, we are living as humanists in a world that, in some ways, wants to undervalue the kinds of knowledge that we believe are vital. So I imagine all three of us faculty here are in the trenches, defending the space of the humanities in a liberal arts education in an institution like Duke, and instead of like fighting for reduced ground, trying to like affirm like its centrality, right? I think that this is a major problem because I don't think we can work our way out of our problems or even live with them with just technical knowledge. We're gonna have to learn how to think about what it means to be human. What is this earth? How do we understand the meaning of our lives in ways that are completely outside of the STEM domain? It's not surprising that I think there are forces that are against the humanities, because the humanities would like to pause and ask questions and make things that appear absolute become relative and complex, right? And it's like that's not the way in which STEM fields are brilliant. That's not how they excel. They don't have that kind of inflection, subjective and intersubjective points of inflection. So it's a question for all of us. How can we like reinsert the importance of questioning everything about the human and about the world in these discussions?
I think it's Margaret Atwood that says that's not just climate change, it's everything change. I think that's very tied to what Gustavo was saying, right? I think technological solutions help us to to reproduce a status quo, but I think it's a status quo that's working for less and less people and maybe wasn't that great to begin with. So I think rather than thinking of these two epistemologies as being oppositional, right? Can we think about them as being complementary and necessary to one another, and necessary maybe even for our continuance as a species as we currently understand ourselves?
I'm reminded of this quote from George Washington Carver, actually, that really it stays with me, and I think it speaks directly to what both Gustavo and Saskia are saying. Carver says that wherever the soil is wasted, the people are wasted. A poor soil produces only a poor people, poor economically, poor spiritually and intellectually, poor physically. And I think impressing on to academia on the world, right? The importance of interdependence, of interrelationality, right? As both Gustavo and Saskia have said, I think that's so crucial. It's so crucial, and I think that one of the things that we contribute, and not to say that tech fields or science fields don't have ethics, but I think that one of the things that we contribute significantly is that ethical dimension or those ethical questions. When I talk about Tuskegee, one of the things that helped me to rethink it, not only as a kind of industrial or agricultural school, but as a place that was imbued with an ethic of care for the least of these, was because they were interested again in democratizing and disseminating knowledge to people who didn't have access to formal education. To me, that is a humanist ethic, I suppose, right? And so I think that if we can, capture that and see it as equally valuable, it's not tangible, it's not going to make us money, right? Per se, um, but it is still essential, right? And I think that if we can capture that and be at the table even when people try um, to silence that ethical voice, all right, to be at the table and insist on its presence, right? We've all been at committee meetings where perhaps at the beginning of the meeting everyone is in agreement, right, that this is a value, but by the end of the meeting it falls away. What happens to be at the end of the meeting and say, actually, have we wrestled with the ethical question? I think is one way that we can ensure that our voices are heard in these conversations. Excuse me.
Yeah, I appreciate hearing that, and I think this panel embodies that intersectional and necessary nature of like these seemingly disparate research areas, but that all are in conversation with one another. And so, really, truly, I want to thank Saskia, Gustavo, and you, Jarvis, for such a great session, and to the audience for your questions. If I didn't get to yours, I apologize. But again, I want to thank our panel and the audience for joining us today.